Have you ever stood before a Cézanne painting feeling simultaneously drawn in and perplexed? Perhaps wondering why this man, whose apples sometimes seem ready to roll off tables that don't quite sit flat, whose mountains appear assembled from patches of color rather than solid rock, whose human figures often look awkwardly posed, is universally hailed as the father of modern art? The apparent simplicity of his subjects, fruit bowls, bathers, landscapes, belies a revolutionary approach that shattered 500 years of Western painting tradition and rebuilt it from the ground up. This disconnect between what appears straightforward and what is profoundly complex makes Cézanne perhaps the most misunderstood genius in art history. Paul Cézanne worked in near isolation for much of his career, stubbornly pursuing a vision that his contemporaries often ridiculed. The Parisian art establishment repeatedly rejected his submissions. Critics mocked his childish technique. Even his fellow artists frequently failed to comprehend what he was attempting. Yet this obstinate antisocial man from Provence would ultimately transform our understanding of how paint on canvas can represent the world, influencing virtually every significant artist who followed him. Picasso wasn't exaggerating when he called Cézanne the father of us all. What makes Cézanne so pivotal and so difficult for casual observers to fully appreciate is that his work operates simultaneously on multiple levels: technical innovation, philosophical inquiry, and profound aesthetic reconsideration of what painting itself could be. To truly see a Cézanne is to understand not just what he painted, but how and why he painted as he did. It requires looking beyond subject matter to recognize a fundamental reimagining of visual representation itself. The technical aspects of Cézanne's approach represent his most immediately recognizable innovation. Unlike his Impressionist contemporaries, who dissolved form into atmospheric effects, Cézanne sought to give Impressionism structure and solidity. His characteristic brushwork, those small parallel strokes often called his constructive stroke, didn't attempt to blend seamlessly as in academic painting. Instead, these distinct touches of color sit visibly on the canvas, simultaneously calling attention to the painting's surface while building three-dimensional form through carefully modulated color relationships. This approach to constructing form marks Cézanne's decisive break with centuries of painting tradition. Since the Renaissance, Western artists had created the illusion of three-dimensional volume primarily through value, the gradation from light to dark across a surface. Cézanne largely abandoned this technique, instead building form through what he called modulation, subtle shifts in color temperature, hue, and intensity. A sphere in Cézanne's hands isn't rendered through smooth shading, but through planes of color that simultaneously create volume while asserting the flatness of the canvas. This tension between flatness and depth represents one of Cézanne's most revolutionary contributions. Traditional perspective created the illusion of looking through the canvas into a coherent, three-dimensional space. Cézanne deliberately undermined this illusion. Tables tilt at impossible angles, multiple viewpoints appear within single compositions. Outlines break and reform, objects simultaneously recede into space and assert themselves as patterns on a flat surface. This wasn't technical incompetence, as early critics claimed, but deliberate strategy, what Cézanne called "my little sensation," an attempt to reconcile visual perception with the physical reality of paint on canvas. Cézanne's treatment of contour further demonstrates his radical approach. In academic painting, objects were clearly delineated by outlines or sharp contrasts between light and shadow. Cézanne frequently allowed contours to dissolve, break, or double, creating what he called passage, areas where background and foreground interpenetrate. This technique creates visual ambiguity that forces viewers to actively participate in constructing the image, making the act of seeing itself part of the painting's subject matter. His use of color similarly defied convention. Rather than mixing colors extensively on the palette to achieve subtle gradations, Cézanne often applied relatively pure colors in distinct strokes that visually blend from a distance. Blues and greens might appear in areas conventionally painted with warm colors. Patches of warm color might appear in shadows. This approach, placing contrasting colors side by side rather than blending them, creates a vibrating energy across the canvas surface while simultaneously building form through color relationships rather than value alone. Cézanne's palette itself evolved dramatically over his career. After an early period of dark, heavily impastoed works, he gradually developed his mature approach featuring a distinctive range of colors. Deep blues, vibrant greens, ochres, and his famous blue-tinged blacks. These colors rarely attempt to precisely match visual appearance, but instead create harmonious relationships that structure the composition while suggesting the underlying permanence of natural forms beyond momentary appearances. The physicality of Cézanne's paint application further distinguishes his work. Unlike the Impressionists' often light, feathery touch, Cézanne built his surfaces through deliberate, sometimes heavy applications of paint. Areas might be densely worked with multiple layers or left relatively thin, creating a surface that varies in texture and depth. This materiality constantly reminds viewers they're looking at paint on canvas, not an illusionistic window, while paradoxically creating a profound sense of the physical solidity of the objects depicted. Perhaps most controversially, Cézanne frequently left portions of canvas visibly unfinished, not from laziness or incompetence, but as deliberate strategy. These non-finito areas force viewers to mentally complete the image, creating active engagement rather than passive reception. They also assert the fundamental difference between painting and photography. Rather than capturing a single moment from a fixed viewpoint, Cézanne's paintings represent accumulated perceptions over time, synthesized through his unique sensibility. Cézanne's approach to composition similarly broke with tradition. Classical composition typically guided the eye through a predetermined pathway, often using triangular structures or the golden ratio to create balanced arrangements. Cézanne's compositions frequently appear decentered or asymmetrical, yet achieve remarkable stability through color relationships and the distribution of visual weight. A seemingly haphazard arrangement of apples across a tilted tabletop reveals, upon closer inspection, a complex network of visual relationships creating perfect equilibrium. These technical innovations weren't merely formal experiments, but reflected Cézanne's deep philosophical engagement with fundamental questions. How do we actually see the world? How can painting represent not just appearances, but underlying structure? How might an artist reconcile subjective perception with objective reality? Cézanne's famous statement that he wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums, reveals his ambition to create art that transcended fleeting sensory impressions to capture something more permanent about visual experience. This philosophical dimension sets Cézanne apart from many contemporaries. While Monet brilliantly captured atmospheric effects and momentary light conditions, Cézanne sought what he called a harmony parallel to nature. He wasn't interested in recording appearances, but in constructing equivalent relationships on canvas, creating autonomous pictorial realities that corresponded to his perception of natural order without merely imitating it. This approach points directly toward 20th century abstraction while remaining rooted in observed reality. Cézanne's obsessive return to certain subjects, Mont Sainte-Victoire, the quarry at Bibimus, still lifes with apples, bathers in landscapes, demonstrates his method. Each painting represents not a single observation, but accumulated study, an attempt to distill essential qualities through prolonged contemplation. Unlike the Impressionists, who often completed works in single sessions to capture momentary effects, Cézanne might work on a canvas for months or years, building it gradually through repeated observation and analysis. This methodical approach reflected Cézanne's temperament, but also his intellectual convictions. He famously advised a young artist to treat nature by means of the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, revealing his belief that underlying geometric structures could be discerned beneath natural appearances. This wasn't abstract theory, but perceptual practice. Cézanne genuinely perceived these geometric foundations through patient observation. His paintings don't impose geometry on nature, but reveal geometry within it. Cézanne's treatment of space further demonstrates his revolutionary vision. Traditional perspective created the illusion of rational, measurable space receding from a fixed viewpoint. Cézanne's space is perceptual rather than mathematical, reflecting how we actually experience the world through movement and accumulated impressions rather than from a single fixed position. Objects in his painting seem simultaneously close and distant, viewed from multiple angles, creating what has been called a new kind of space, neither fully three-dimensional nor completely flat, but oscillating between these states. This approach to space directly influenced Cubism, which further fractured perspective into multiple simultaneous viewpoints. Picasso and Braque recognized that Cézanne had begun the process they would continue, breaking apart Renaissance perspective to create representation based on knowledge rather than appearance alone. When Picasso declared that Cézanne was my one and only master, he acknowledged this fundamental connection between Cézanne's spatial innovations and Cubism's more radical fragmentation. The emotional quality of Cézanne's work presents another paradox. Though he claimed to paint without emotion, focusing solely on sensation and construction, his works convey profound feeling through their very structure. The stability of his compositions creates meditative calm. His vibrating color relationships generate subtle tension. His balanced arrangements evoke harmonious order. These qualities arise not from expressive brushwork or dramatic subject matter, but from fundamental pictorial relationships, emotion embedded in structure itself. This integration of feeling with form distinguishes Cézanne from both academic painters, who often imposed emotion through narrative content, and expressionists, who conveyed feeling through gestural distortion. Cézanne's emotion emerges organically from his engagement with visual perception and pictorial construction. His paintings don't illustrate emotions, but embody them through their very existence as structured objects, creating what Roger Fry called the emotional significance of pure form. Cézanne's relationship with tradition further complicates understanding his achievement. Though revolutionary, he remained deeply engaged with art history, particularly Venetian painting, Poussin, Delacroix, and Courbet. He spent countless hours copying masterworks in the Louvre, not to imitate their style, but to understand their underlying principles. His famous goal, to redo Poussin after nature, reveals his ambition to combine classical composition with direct observational truth, creating a new synthesis rather than merely rejecting tradition. This historical consciousness separates Cézanne from artistic iconoclasts who simply opposed established practices. He sought not to destroy tradition, but to revitalize it through radical reconsideration of its fundamental principles. His innovations emerged from deep engagement with painting's history, not ignorance of it. This complex relationship with the past, simultaneously respectful and revolutionary, makes Cézanne's achievement particularly difficult to categorize within conventional art historical narratives. Cézanne's influence on subsequent art cannot be overstated. Beyond directly inspiring Cubism, arguably the 20th century's most significant stylistic development, his work established principles that informed virtually every modern movement. His emphasis on the painting's surface as a site of autonomous pictorial activity rather than illusionistic window laid groundwork for abstraction. His construction of form through color relationships rather than value alone influenced everything from Fauvism to color field painting. His integration of multiple viewpoints anticipated not just Cubism, but various approaches to time and movement in modern art. More subtly, Cézanne's example legitimized the artist's right to follow personal vision, regardless of public incomprehension or critical hostility. His stubborn pursuit of his little sensation, despite decades of rejection, demonstrated artistic integrity that became increasingly important as modern art moved further from public taste. When Willem de Kooning declared Cézanne was the first painter to rely entirely on his sensations, he acknowledged this fundamental aspect of Cézanne's legacy, the validation of subjective perception as artistic foundation. The biographical dimensions of Cézanne's achievement add further complexity to understanding his work. Born to a wealthy banking family in Aix-en-Provence, he had financial security that allowed him to pursue his vision without commercial success, a privilege denied many contemporaries. Yet he faced extraordinary obstacles: academic rejection, critical ridicule, public incomprehension, and significant periods of isolation from artistic communities. His awkward personality and frequent reclusiveness further complicated his artistic development, forcing him to find solutions through solitary struggle rather than collaborative exchange. This isolation partially explains Cézanne's unique path. Working primarily in Provence, away from Paris's artistic ferment, he developed approaches untethered from prevailing fashions. His famous late works around Mont Sainte-Victoire reflect not just aesthetic choices, but physical circumstances. His daily proximity to this particular landscape allowed the sustained observation central to his method. Similarly, his preference for studio-based still lifes over Impressionism's outdoor scenes partly reflected his temperamental discomfort with public painting, but resulted in revolutionary reconsideration of this traditionally minor genre. Cézanne's late recognition, he was in his 50s before receiving significant critical attention and his 60s before achieving commercial success, further complicates his legacy. Unlike immediate sensations that characterize many artistic revolutions, Cézanne's innovations required prolonged consideration to be properly understood. When dealer Ambroise Vollard mounted Cézanne's first solo exhibition in 1895, most critics remained baffled, but younger artists immediately recognized his importance. This generational divide in reception illuminates Cézanne's position as bridge between 19th century traditions and 20th century modernism. The technical challenges of viewing Cézanne properly further explain his historically delayed recognition. His works often appear most disjointed when viewed from conventional distances. Standing too close, viewers see only disconnected brushstrokes. Too far away, the structural innovations become invisible beneath subject matter. Finding the precise distance where his constructive method coheres without disappearing requires active viewing, uncommon in casual art appreciation. This necessary engagement, the viewer must work to see properly, represents another revolutionary aspect of his approach. Cézanne's treatment of traditional genres, landscape, still life, portraiture, figure composition, demonstrates his method of working both within and against established categories. His landscapes reject both the atmospheric effects of Impressionism and the narrative drama of Romanticism, instead creating structured harmonies through color relationships and simplified forms. His still lifes elevate this traditionally minor genre to philosophical inquiry through their investigation of perception and representation. His portraits combine psychological penetration with formal experimentation, often sacrificing conventional likeness for deeper structural truth. His treatment of the human figure perhaps most clearly demonstrates his radical approach. Unlike academic figure painting with its emphasis on anatomical correctness and idealized form, Cézanne's figures often appear awkward or distorted. This wasn't technical limitation, but deliberate strategy, treating the human body as visual problem to be solved through the same constructive methods he applied to landscapes and still lifes. His famous bathers, neither fully naturalistic nor completely stylized, exist in an ambiguous zone between observation and conceptualization that anticipates much 20th century figurative art. The evolution of Cézanne's approach through his career reveals both consistency of vision and continuous development. His early works, heavily influenced by Courbet and Delacroix, feature dark palettes and expressionistic brushwork that seem distant from his mature style. His middle period, closer to Impressionism through contact with Pissarro, introduced lighter colors and outdoor subjects. His late works achieve the most perfect synthesis of observation and construction, with increasingly geometric simplification and vibrant color relationships. Yet, throughout these changes, his fundamental concern remained consistent, creating structured pictorial equivalents to perceptual experience. Cézanne's famous statement to Émile Bernard, that nature should be treated by the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, has often been misinterpreted as advocacy for imposing geometric abstraction on natural forms. His actual practice reveals more subtle intent, perceiving underlying geometric tendencies within nature through prolonged observation. A Cézanne apple isn't rendered as abstract sphere, but as specific fruit, whose essential sphericity emerges through patient looking. This approach, finding structure within appearance rather than imposing it from outside, distinguishes Cézanne's method from more theoretical approaches to geometric form. The materiality of Cézanne's paint further complicates understanding his achievement. Unlike both academic painters, who concealed brushwork to create smooth illusion, and impressionists, whose visible brushwork captured atmospheric effects, Cézanne's distinctive stroke simultaneously builds form and asserts the painting's physical reality as pigment on surface. This dual function, creating representation while acknowledging the means of representation, marks fundamental shift from illusionistic to modernist painting, where the material conditions of art making become integral to meaning rather than something to be concealed. Color relationships form perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Cézanne's technical approach, moving beyond both academic color, which subordinated hue to value in creating form, and impressionist color, which recorded atmospheric effects. Cézanne developed what might be called structural color, using temperature contrasts, complementary relationships, and subtle modulations to simultaneously create form and organize compositional space. A patch of blue in a Cézanne might simultaneously represent sky, create spatial recession, balance a complementary orange elsewhere in the composition, and participate in constructing three-dimensional form through color modulation. This complex approach to color requires analytical seeing that casual viewers often find challenging. Where impressionist color provides immediate sensory pleasure and academic color supports easily readable representation, Cézanne's color demands active engagement with both perceptual and compositional relationships. The famous blues and greens in his shadows don't record actual appearance, but create structural counterpoint to warmer hues in illuminated areas. This use of color as architectural element rather than descriptive property anticipates much 20th century painting, from Matisse through abstract expressionism to color field. Cézanne's distinctive brushwork, those parallel strokes often called his constructive stroke, further demonstrates his innovation. Unlike academic brushwork, which disappeared into smooth surfaces, or impressionist brushwork, which dissolved form into atmosphere, Cézanne's stroke simultaneously builds form and asserts its own materiality. These visible marks, often uniform in size and orientation regardless of the object being depicted, create visual continuity across different elements in the composition. A tabletop, apple, and background wall might all be constructed from similar strokes, creating unified pictorial surface while still maintaining representational distinctions. This approach to brushwork directly influenced subsequent painting. Matisse adopted similarly constructive marks in his early work. Cubists developed more geometric version of Cézanne's faceted surfaces. Abstract expressionists expanded his visible brushwork into gestural abstraction. Even minimalist approaches to uniform surface treatment can be traced partially to Cézanne's recognition that consistency of mark-making could create pictorial unity, independent of subject matter. Cézanne's treatment of perspective represents perhaps his most radical technical innovation. Traditional perspective created the illusion of rational space receding from fixed viewpoint through converging orthogonals and diminishing scale. Cézanne systematically undermined these conventions, creating what has been called warped or shifting perspective that more accurately reflects actual perceptual experience. Tables tilt forward, defying gravity. Multiple viewpoints coexist within single compositions. Objects simultaneously recede into depth and assert themselves as patterns on flat surface. This approach wasn't arbitrary distortion, but reflection of how we actually see. Not in single frozen moment from fixed position, as Renaissance perspective suggests, but through accumulated impressions gathered as our eyes move across a scene. When Cézanne painted a still life from slightly different angles simultaneously, he wasn't being technically incompetent, but recording the reality of perception over time. This reconception of perspective as perceptual rather than mathematical directly anticipated Cubism's more radical fracturing of viewpoint. The compositional structure of Cézanne's paintings further demonstrates his innovation. Rather than employing traditional devices like the golden section or triangular arrangements, Cézanne often created seemingly asymmetrical compositions that achieve balance through color relationships and the distribution of visual weight. A Cézanne landscape might lack obvious compositional formula, yet achieve perfect equilibrium through subtle adjustments of color intensity, directional force, and spatial interval. This approach created compositions that feel simultaneously natural and carefully constructed, emerging organically from observation rather than imposed by formula. This aspect of Cézanne's approach particularly influenced subsequent abstract painting. When Mondrian moved from representational to geometric abstraction, he carried forward Cézanne's understanding of compositional balance through relationships rather than symmetry. When abstract expressionists created seemingly spontaneous compositions, they built upon Cézanne's discovery that balanced asymmetry could create more dynamic harmony than traditional formal arrangements. This legacy extends through virtually all modern approaches to non-traditional composition. Cézanne's treatment of pictorial space, neither fully illusionistic nor completely flat, represents another revolutionary aspect of his work. Traditional painting since the Renaissance had created the illusion of looking through the canvas into coherent, three-dimensional space. Cézanne created what might be called shallow space, simultaneously suggesting depth while asserting the flatness of the picture plane. Objects in a Cézanne still life might overlap, suggesting spatial recession, yet the tabletop might tilt forward, contradicting that same spatial logic. This deliberate spatial ambiguity forces viewers to constantly readjust their perception, creating dynamic viewing experience rather than passive reception of fixed illusion. This approach to space directly influenced Cubism's more radical spatial experiments. When Picasso and Braque fragmented objects across the canvas surface, they extended Cézanne's initial disruption of traditional perspective. When subsequent abstract painters abandoned representation entirely while maintaining suggestions of spatial relationships, they built upon Cézanne's discovery that pictorial space could function autonomously from realistic depiction. This reconception of painting as creating its own spatial reality rather than imitating observed space remains central to modern pictorial thinking. The philosophical implications of Cézanne's approach extend far beyond technical innovation. By refusing both academic idealization and impressionist sensation in favor of structured perception, he raised fundamental questions about the nature of representation itself. If paintings aren't meant to create perfect illusions or record fleeting impressions, what exactly are they doing? Cézanne's answer, creating structured equivalents to perceptual experience that reveal underlying order, anticipated phenomenology's philosophical investigations into the structures of consciousness and perception. Maurice Merleau-Ponty recognized this connection in his famous essay, Cézanne's Doubt, arguing that Cézanne's paintings reveal how perception itself operates. not as passive recording of external reality, but as active structuring process, integrating multiple sensations into coherent experience. When Cézanne painted an apple from slightly different angles simultaneously, he wasn't being technically incompetent, but accurately representing how perception synthesizes multiple viewpoints into unified understanding. This philosophical dimension elevates Cézanne's work from mere stylistic innovation to profound inquiry into human consciousness. Cézanne's famous statement that he wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums, reveals another aspect of his philosophical position, the desire to reconcile modern perceptual truth with classical permanence. Unlike Impressionists who celebrated transience and atmospheric effects, Cézanne sought underlying structures that persisted beyond momentary appearances. This wasn't conservative reaction against modernity, but attempt to create new synthesis, representation based on direct perception that nonetheless accessed timeless qualities beneath changing appearances. This philosophical ambition partly explains why Cézanne's work initially puzzled contemporaries, yet proved so influential for subsequent generations. He wasn't simply extending existing approaches, but fundamentally reconceiving what painting could be. Neither academic illustration nor impressionist sensation, but structured inquiry into the relationship between perception and representation. This radical reconception required time to be properly understood, explaining why younger artists recognized his importance before critics or public. Cézanne's relationship with nature further illuminates his philosophical approach. Unlike Romantic painters who projected emotional states onto landscape, or Impressionists who recorded sensory effects of light and atmosphere, Cézanne sought what he called the truth in things. This wasn't naive realism, but sophisticated attempt to perceive underlying structures through prolonged observation. His famous paintings of Mont Sainte-Victoire, repeatedly observed over decades, represent not single views, but accumulated understanding. Geological permanence perceived through sustained attention rather than momentary impression. This approach to nature significantly influenced subsequent landscape painting. When Cubists fractured natural forms into geometric components, they extended Cézanne's initial analysis of structural elements within landscape. When abstract expressionists sought essential qualities rather than appearances in their landscape-influenced abstractions, they built upon Cézanne's distinction between superficial effect and underlying structure. His approach to nature as simultaneously observed reality and structured harmony continues informing landscape painting through present day. The reception history of Cézanne's work provides fascinating case study in artistic influence and critical evolution. Initially rejected by academic juries and ridiculed by critics, his paintings gradually gained appreciation first among fellow artists, then progressive critics, then collectors, and finally public institutions. This pattern, where innovative work is first recognized by peers, then critical avant-garde, then market, then museums, became standard trajectory for modern art, with Cézanne providing prototype for subsequently accelerated version of this recognition pattern. Particularly revealing is the generational nature of Cézanne's initial reception. While established critics often remained baffled by his work, younger artists immediately recognized its revolutionary implications. When Picasso and Matisse separately identified Cézanne as primary influence, they acknowledged his position as bridge between 19th century traditions and 20th century innovation. This generational divide in reception illuminates Cézanne's pivotal historical position, too radical for contemporaries, yet foundational for subsequent developments. The technical challenges of properly seeing Cézanne further explain his historically delayed recognition. His paintings often appear most disjointed when viewed conventionally, either too close, where individual brushstrokes dominate, or too far, where structural innovations become invisible beneath subject matter. Finding precise distance where his constructive method coheres without disappearing requires active viewing, uncommon in casual art appreciation. This necessary engagement, the viewer must work to see properly, represents another revolutionary aspect of his approach. Cézanne's late recognition, major exhibition success came only in his 50s, significant sales in his 60s, further complicates understanding his achievement. Unlike innovations that generated immediate sensation, his approach required prolonged consideration to be properly understood. When dealer Ambroise Vollard mounted Cézanne's first solo exhibition in 1895, most critics remained baffled while younger artists immediately recognized its importance. This delayed recognition partially explains why assessments of Cézanne's significance continued evolving throughout 20th century. The scholarly re-evaluation of Cézanne across decades demonstrates this evolution. Early modernist critics emphasized his structural innovations as pathway to abstraction, sometimes oversimplifying his relationship with observed reality. Later scholarship recognized more complex position, neither traditionally representational nor proto-abstract, but occupying unique territory between these positions. Recent approaches have further nuanced understanding, examining his work through lenses ranging from phenomenology to materialist analysis of his working methods. This continuing scholarly engagement reflects Cézanne's unique historical position. Unlike artists whose significance stabilizes once initial innovation is absorbed into standard narratives, Cézanne's work continues generating new interpretations precisely because it occupies ambiguous position between traditions, neither fully representational nor completely abstract, neither wholly traditional nor entirely modern. His paintings resist definitive categorization within conventional art historical frameworks. This productive ambiguity ensures ongoing reassessment as critical perspectives themselves evolve. The market history of Cézanne's work further illuminates his reception. After decades of commercial failure, his paintings began achieving significant prices in early 1900s, with values rising dramatically after his death in 1906. By mid-20th century, Cézanne's works commanded among highest prices for any artist, with museums and major collectors competing for increasingly rare available paintings. This dramatic market trajectory, from virtually unsaleable to among most valuable artworks ever created, parallels critical reassessment from ridiculed oddity to foundational master. Perhaps most revealing aspect of Cézanne's reception history is how different generations have emphasized different aspects of his achievement. Early modernists focused primarily on his structural innovations as pathway to abstraction. Mid-century critics emphasized his philosophical dimensions and phenomenological insights. More recent interpretations have explored his material practices and historical contextuality. Rather than indicating unstable assessment, this evolution demonstrates the multidimensional nature of his achievement, different aspects becoming visible as critical frameworks themselves develop. For contemporary viewers, properly seeing Cézanne requires awareness of these multiple dimensions. Beyond appreciating technical innovations or historical significance, engaging with Cézanne's work demands active perceptual participation, finding the distance where his constructive method coheres, allowing eyes to move across the canvas as his did during creation, perceiving relationships between seemingly disparate elements. Unlike both academic painting, which presents predetermined illusion, and impressionism, which offers immediate sensory pleasure, Cézanne's work requires viewers to actively reconstruct his perceptual process. This necessary engagement explains both the initial difficulty many viewers experience with Cézanne and the profound satisfaction his work ultimately provides. Unlike paintings that offer immediate visual gratification, Cézanne's canvases reveal themselves gradually through sustained attention. The apparent awkwardness that might initially distract casual observers gradually resolves into sophisticated pictorial logic. Seemingly arbitrary color choices reveal themselves as complex structural relationships. Apparently distorted perspectives emerge as accurate records of perceptual experience rather than mathematical constructs. Properly understanding Cézanne requires recognizing this fundamental aspect of his achievement. He wasn't merely developing new style, but reconceiving what painting itself could be. Rather than creating either realistic illusions or expressive distortions, he sought what he called a harmony parallel to nature. Autonomous pictorial reality that corresponded to his perception of natural order without merely imitating appearances. This approach, creating structured equivalents to perceptual experience rather than illusionistic copies, anticipates virtually all subsequent developments in modern painting. Cézanne's unique historical position, neither fully traditional nor completely modern, partially explains both his initial rejection and his profound subsequent influence. Too radical for academic acceptance, yet too structured for impressionist inclusion, he developed an approach that synthesized seemingly contradictory elements. Direct observation with conceptual understanding, perceptual truth with compositional order, representational content with autonomous pictorial structure. This synthetic quality allowed his work to influence movements as diverse as Cubism, Fauvism, abstract expressionism, and minimalism, despite their apparent differences. The technical challenges of Cézanne's approach further explain both his isolated development and his delayed recognition. Unlike both academic technique, which could be systematically taught through established methods, and impressionist approach, which could be understood through direct observation of natural effects, Cézanne's method required simultaneous engagement with perception and construction that defied simple formulation. His famous advice to treat nature by means of the cylinder, the sphere, the cone, provides general principle, but not specific method. Each painting required fresh solution to unique perceptual problem. This absence of formulaic method distinguishes Cézanne from both academic system and avant-garde manifesto, where academic painting offered clear rules for creating predetermined effects and avant-garde movements often provided programmatic approaches to stylistic innovation. Cézanne offered neither, only the example of his struggle to reconcile perception with representation through patient observation and constructive technique. This methodological openness partially explains his influence across otherwise contradictory movements. Different artists could draw different lessons from his non-dogmatic example. The emotional quality of Cézanne's work presents another paradox. Though he claimed to paint without emotion, focusing solely on sensation and construction, his paintings convey profound feeling through their very structure. The stability of his compositions creates meditative calm. His vibrating color relationships generate subtle tension. His balanced arrangements evoke harmonious order. These qualities arise not from expressive brushwork or dramatic subject matter, but from fundamental pictorial relationships. Emotion embedded in structure itself, rather than imposed through narrative or gestural excess. This integration of feeling with form distinguishes Cézanne from both academic painters, who often imposed emotion through narrative content, and expressionists, who conveyed feeling through gestural distortion. Cézanne's emotion emerges organically from his engagement with visual perception and pictorial construction. His paintings don't illustrate emotions, but embody them through their very existence as structured objects, creating what Roger Fry called the emotional significance of pure form. This approach, finding feeling within formal relationships rather than expressing it through distortion, influenced numerous subsequent approaches to non-expressive emotional content. Cézanne's relationship with tradition further complicates understanding his achievement. Though revolutionary, he remained deeply engaged with art history, particularly Venetian painting, Poussin, Delacroix, and Courbet. He spent countless hours copying masterworks in the Louvre, not to imitate their style, but to understand their underlying principles. His famous goal, to redo Poussin after nature, reveals his ambition to combine classical composition with direct observational truth, creating new synthesis rather than merely rejecting tradition. This historical consciousness separates Cézanne from artistic iconoclasts who simply opposed established practices. He sought not to destroy tradition, but to revitalize it through radical reconsideration of its fundamental principles. His innovations emerged from deep engagement with painting's history, not ignorance of it. This complex relationship with the past, simultaneously respectful and revolutionary, makes Cézanne's achievement particularly difficult to categorize within conventional art historical narratives that often emphasize rupture over continuity. The philosophical implications of Cézanne's approach extend far beyond technical innovation. By refusing both academic idealization and impressionist sensation in favor of structured perception, he raised fundamental questions about the nature of representation itself. If paintings aren't meant to create perfect illusions or record fleeting impressions, what exactly are they doing? Cézanne's answer: creating structured equivalents to perceptual experience that reveal underlying order, anticipated phenomenology's philosophical investigations into the structures of consciousness and perception. Maurice Merleau-Ponty recognized this connection in his famous essay, Cézanne's Doubt, arguing that Cézanne's paintings reveal how perception itself operates, not as passive recording of external reality, but as active structuring process, integrating multiple sensations into coherent experience. When Cézanne painted an apple from slightly different angles simultaneously, he wasn't being technically incompetent, but accurately representing how perception synthesizes multiple viewpoints into unified understanding. This philosophical dimension elevates Cézanne's work from mere stylistic innovation to profound inquiry into human consciousness. For contemporary viewers, the challenge of properly seeing Cézanne remains significant. Cultural conditioning has trained most observers to expect either realistic representation or obvious stylization. Cézanne's work occupies ambiguous territory between these expectations. His apples aren't photographic reproductions, yet they aren't abstract symbols either. His landscapes don't create perfect illusions, yet they aren't merely formal arrangements of color. This ambiguity, simultaneously representational and autonomous, observed and constructed, perceptual and conceptual, creates productive tension that rewards sustained engagement. The proper approach to viewing Cézanne involves active perceptual participation rather than passive reception, where academic painting presents predetermined illusion requiring only recognition, and Impressionism offers immediate sensory pleasure requiring only receptivity. Cézanne demands engagement with the very process of seeing itself. Viewers must allow their eyes to move across the canvas, as his did during creation, perceiving relationships between seemingly disparate elements, reconstructing the perceptual logic behind his seemingly awkward distortions and arbitrary color choices. This necessary engagement explains both the initial difficulty many viewers experience with Cézanne and the profound satisfaction his work ultimately provides. Unlike paintings that offer immediate visual gratification, Cézanne's canvases reveal themselves gradually through sustained attention. The apparent awkwardness that might initially distract casual observers gradually resolves into sophisticated pictorial logic. Seemingly arbitrary color choices reveal themselves as complex structural relationships. Apparently distorted perspectives emerge as accurate records of perceptual experience rather than mathematical constructs. The contemporary relevance of Cézanne extends beyond historical influence to ongoing inspiration for current artistic practice. In an era dominated by digital imagery and conceptual approaches, his insistence on the irreducible materiality of paint and the necessity of direct perceptual engagement offers valuable counterpoint to dematerialized art forms. His recognition that representation involves active construction rather than passive recording remains relevant to digital age understanding of image creation. His synthesis of observation with conceptual understanding continues informing approaches to representation across media. For casual viewers encountering Cézanne for the first time, several approaches may facilitate meaningful engagement. First, allow sufficient time. These aren't paintings that reveal themselves instantly, but require sustained attention. Second, view from multiple distances, stepping back to perceive overall compositional relationships, moving closer to observe constructive brushwork, finding intermediate distance where these aspects integrate. Third, actively trace relationships between elements, how color harmonies create connections across seemingly separate objects, how directional forces balance throughout composition, how spatial ambiguities create dynamic viewing experience. Most importantly, approach Cézanne with awareness that apparent awkwardness or distortion reflects deliberate strategy rather than technical limitation. The table that tilts forward defying gravity, the multiple perspectives within single composition, the broken contours and visible brushwork. These aren't failures to achieve conventional effects, but successful attempts to create new kind of pictorial truth. Recognizing this intentionality transforms apparent flaws into revolutionary achievements, allowing viewers to appreciate the profound reconsideration of visual representation these awkward qualities embody. Cézanne's achievement ultimately transcends categorization within conventional art historical narratives. Neither academic nor avant-garde, neither fully traditional nor completely modern, his work occupies unique position that continues generating new interpretations precisely because it resists definitive classification. This productive ambiguity ensures Cézanne's continuing relevance as both historical pivot point and ongoing inspiration. The artist who, in Picasso's famous phrase, remains the father of us all, not through dogmatic influence, but through example of unflinching engagement with fundamental questions of perception and representation. For those willing to engage actively with his work, Cézanne offers remarkable reward. The opportunity to see the world through eyes that perceived underlying structure beneath superficial appearance, permanent relationships beneath momentary effects, harmonious order beneath visual chaos. His paintings don't merely represent apples, mountains, or bathers, but embody structured equivalent to perceptual experience itself. Demonstration that painting can be not merely decorative surface or illusionistic window, but autonomous reality with its own internal logic and emotional resonance. This achievement, creating paintings that function simultaneously as representations of observed reality and as autonomous pictorial structures with their own internal relationships, defines Cézanne's revolutionary contribution. By refusing to choose between representation and abstraction, between perception and conception, between tradition and innovation, he created third position that transcended these apparent oppositions. This synthetic quality explains his profound influence across otherwise contradictory movements. Different artists could draw different lessons from his non-dogmatic example without exhausting its implications. A century after his death, Cézanne's paintings continue revealing new aspects with each generation's engagement. What early modernists saw primarily as pathway to abstraction, mid-century critics recognized as phenomenological investigation, and contemporary viewers might understand as exploration of materiality and embodied perception. This continuing evolution of response doesn't indicate unstable assessment, but rather multi-dimensional achievement that generates new insights as critical frameworks themselves develop. Few artists in history have sustained such productive reinterpretation across changing cultural contexts. For those encountering Cézanne today, the challenge remains seeing beyond subject matter to recognize the revolutionary approach that transformed how paint on canvas could represent the world. Those famous apples aren't merely fruit, but investigations into how form emerges through color relationships. Those tilted tables aren't mistakes, but deliberate strategies to reconcile multiple perspectives. Those broken contours aren't technical failures, but sophisticated attempts to represent the active nature of perception itself. Recognizing these intentions transforms apparent awkwardness into profound insight, allowing contemporary viewers to appreciate why this difficult, antisocial man from Provence changed everything about how we understand what painting can be.